This is episode 6 of Away, a podcast for anyone interested in a secular approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. Hi everyone, it's December 18th, about 8:30 in the evening, and this is episode 6. Welcome! I was looking through the new book, One Big Tent. Atheist and agnostic AA members share their experience, strength, and hope. It's published by the AA Grapevine and printed in Canada. And it is a long time coming. And I want to take a minute to be grateful to all the people who have made this book possible and who have paved the way for atheists in AA to be able to say it with a little bit more confidence at least, and feel a little safer doing so. And for making their voices loud and clear so that none of us feels alone, believer or not. What it really is a collection of stories and essays by atheists, and it opens with a quote that I've already read to you by Bill in the Grapevine in July 1965. I think it's a great starting point. Progress is never as fast as we'd like it to be. The first essay in the book, the earliest essay in this book is from 1964, an essay by Jim Burwell, who is considered the voice of atheism when they wrote the big book in 1938. And it was he and perhaps fellow travelers in the first 100 who insisted that certain parts be taken out or reworded so that it felt more inclusive. By 1964, he felt a little more emboldened, thankfully, to speak out a little more about his atheism, though I think he called himself the reluctant agnostic later in life. But he's certainly someone, a lot of us atheists say friends of Jim instead of friends of Bill as sort of a joke. So the stories in this book go back. There's one from 1969 called Is Agnostic a Nasty Word? There's one from 1976 called Equal Time for Atheists. From 1964, Can an Atheist Find a Place in AA? It's worth going to aagrapevine.org and ordering a copy, I think, especially if you're struggling. If you know you're an atheist and you're firmly rooted in atheism, or you consider yourself agnostic on the issue, or you are struggling and think you have to find a label in order to stay sober, I think this would be a really good book to read to help you, A, not to feel so alone or different from, to know that there are many other people going back through the history of AA who have felt the same way you do. So I think it's really important that the AA mission be carried through on all these principles. That is to say, you shouldn't feel alone or different from or less than anyone in that room, believer or not. I picked out a few passages that I really like to share with you, with the hope that you'll buy a copy or at least listen to this podcast and be helped by it, feel supported, feel less alone. So Judith N. from Marysville, Washington, in her essay, The Transformation, from October 2004, writes, "Was a spiritual awakening necessary for lifelong sobriety? If I didn't have one, was I going to drink again? I thought of all the stuff I was involved in, sponsoring a new woman, editing an AA newsletter, going to the jail meeting every Saturday morning, and being the GSR for my home group. Was I just whistling in the dark until the inevitable occurred? My neat little home, filled with teenagers who were just beginning to trust their sober mother, were they all at risk if some manifestation of God didn't happen to me? Was this empathy for other drunks and tolerance for the world in general all part of my mind's big con job to lull me into false security? As our AA carload headed home that night, happy and noisy and loving life without booze, I felt restless. So I like that paragraph, mostly because I can really identify. In the early days, my own early days, I very much felt that way, and perhaps you do too. From Jim Burwell's essay, Sober for 30 Years, written in May 1968, he writes, "For the new agnostic or atheist just coming in, I will try to give very briefly my milestones in recovery. 1. The first power I found greater than myself was John Barleycorn. 2. The AA fellowship became my higher power for the first 2 years. 3. Gradually, I came to believe that God and good were synonymous and were to be found in all of us. 4. And I found that by meditating and trying to tune in on my better self for guidance and answers, I became more comfortable and steady." Honestly, there's very few better ways to say it. I think that I very strongly identify with that. My hope is that you do too. A serious atheist, in some sense, may have to work harder than the believer, and may work harder than the believer. Personally, because I can never give anything up to God, I have to work constantly and vigilantly on my quote-unquote defects all the time. That is a practice. There is no perfection. But it requires thoughtfulness and effort. As I've talked about in a previous podcast, even for a believer, a real believer, prayer is not enough. It's like making a wish. Prayer must be followed by action. You pray for the hungry and then you feed them. I know plenty of believers who work very hard to stay sober, to become better people, better citizens of the world. I also know plenty of believers who are lazy, who think that step 6 and 7 involve a lot of waiting and not a lot of work. And I'm sure we've all met an atheist who appears to have chosen the label because he or she did not want to search. And his or her choice seems lazy. And perhaps it was lazy. I do not think that is the typical atheist in AA. I think most atheists and agnostics, and this book supports my argument, have had a rough go of it and have felt obligated to search even when some part of them understood they would never find, and have had to work harder and fight more to find their place in AA, which is in direct opposition to what the program is really supposed to be about. From an essay called An Atheist Asks in August 2011, the final 2 paragraphs. I love a number of people who are Christian. Because of my upbringing, I understand the basis of their beliefs, and I am respectful of their opinions, to the exact extent that they're respectful of mine. Conversely, it's easy for a person to become frightened or even hostile toward that which is unknown. Whether you were raised a believer or not, try asking yourself this question: does my faith, or lack thereof, afford me the courage to put aside my fears for the opportunity of understanding something different? That's a phenomenal question. That really is, do I want to be narrow-minded or do I want to be open-minded? Do I want to accept that there are other ways through AA, that perhaps the big book is merely a starting point, and that there is more to it than finding God and giving it over? Lastly, I want to read from Can an Atheist Find a Place in AA? From June 1964. I believe that there is a place in the world and in AA for people who do not have the capacity to believe, and that we are no more or no greater oddballs than those people who do believe. After all, faith is not something that you can buy packaged and ready for sale in a grocery store. You either believe or you don't believe. And if you don't, stop worrying about it. You can still stay sober. Is there a God or isn't there? I say it doesn't matter. Keep an open mind and don't give up the fight because of a slogan or someone's personal credo. The highway is wide enough for all of us. And the rules for pedestrians are keep an open mind and keep coming back. We're going to start on chapter 3, more about alcoholism. On the first page of it, page 30, the start of the second paragraph, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like other people, or presently may be, has to be smashed. We alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drinking. We know that no real alcoholic ever recovers control. Skipping down a little, we are convinced that alcoholics of our type are in the grip of a progressive illness. Over any considerable period, we get worse, never better. So this is step 1. And it does not make mention of God, even once. In fact, that whole first page of More About Alcoholism does not make mention of God. We have to fully concede to our innermost selves. I admitted I was powerless over alcohol. That doesn't mean I admitted I'm powerless over anything else. I'm certainly not powerless if I don't pick up the first drink. I only become powerless when I pick up the first drink. That's what starts the cycle in motion. I am powerless over alcohol when I take a drink. And that's actually very clear in this first page of More About Alcoholism. On page 31, skipping down about halfway through, I just like this paragraph. Here are some of the methods we have tried. Drinking beer only, limiting the number of drinks, never drinking alone, never drinking in the morning, drinking only at home, never having it in the house, never drinking during business hours, drinking only at parties, switching from scotch to brandy, drinking only natural wines, agreeing to resign if ever drunk on the job, taking a trip, not taking a trip, swearing off forever with and without a solemn oath, taking more physical exercise, reading inspirational books, going to health farms and sanitariums, accepting voluntary commitment to asylums, we could increase the list ad infinitum. So I don't know about you. I tried one or more of those things to convince myself I didn't have a problem or to try and arrest the problem. So I just think that's a fun little paragraph, a sort of reminder of the kookiness. The chapter continues with some stories that are worth reading because I think, again, maybe you'll identify with one of them if you haven't identified yet with any of the stories that have been presented. So now I'm on page 34, skipping down to the middle of the page. For those who are unable to drink moderately, the question is how to stop altogether. We are assuming, of course, that the reader desires to stop. Whether such a person can quit upon a non-spiritual basis depends upon the extent to which he has already lost the power to choose whether he will drink or not. Let's break this down a little. By now, I've gone ahead and reframed spiritual, or used an alternative but still accurate definition for the word, of or relating to the mind or intellect closely akin in interests, attitude, and outlook. Can I quit on a non-spiritual basis? Perhaps not. But does spiritual have to mean supernatural? No, it does not. So perhaps I can't quit on a non-spiritual basis, but if I am defining spiritual differently from the people who equate it only with the supernatural, then perhaps the statement is true. So let's reframe the statement. Can I quit without using my mind and my intellect, without changing some of my interests, attitude, and outlooks? Probably not. Keeping in mind that the writers of this book had their own life experiences, coloring their opinions, try as they might to leave them out, we all have that, our own paradigm. And, dare I say it, motives. People's motives matter. Spirituality and theism are not synonymous. For me, spirituality, if I'm pressed to use the word at all, is no more than my conscience. It is the essence of me, my goodness, my kindness. Moving on to page 35, I just like the story. Our first example is a friend we shall call Jim. This man has a charming life and family. He inherited a lucrative automobile agency. He had a commendable World War record. He is a good salesman. So to make his long story short, he is trying to get sober. He goes out for a sales call. Suddenly the thought crossed his mind that if he were to put an ounce of whiskey in his milk, it couldn't hurt on a full stomach. The reason I like this story and I identify with it, but one example in my own story is actually my last night drinking. It was the night before the baptism of a dear friend's baby. And it sort of perfectly exemplifies all my drinking. I went out on a date and I would, quote, be home early because I had this baptism the next day. I thought, we'll just have a drink or two and I'd head home. Well, guess what? Hours of bar hopping and an all-nighter, plenty of cocaine, MDMA, the whole thing. And suddenly the baptism was no longer on the schedule. Why? When I knew I had something important to do. Why? And I hear a lot of alcoholics say that. And why did we sabotage ourselves? An addiction is more important than anything else. It takes over your life. Nothing can come before it. And still, some of us probably were anxious or fearful about the upcoming event, even if it was supposed to be a joyous occasion. If you suffer with social anxiety disorder, any big social occasion can be terrifying. And I know for me, I didn't like saying no to people. It was easier somehow to cancel at the last minute because I was sick or something. Sabotage myself, give myself a reason not to go, instead of either facing my fear or setting a boundary and saying, I can't handle that. I can't do that. So that story appeals to me for that reason. Moving on to page 37, second to last paragraph. In some circumstances, we have gone out deliberately to get drunk, feeling ourselves justified by nervousness, anger, worry, depression, jealousy, or the like. But even in this type of beginning, we are obliged to admit that our justification for a spree was insanely insufficient in the light of what always happened. Our behavior is as absurd and incomprehensible with respect to the first drink as that of an individual with a passion, say, for jaywalking. He gets a thrill out of skipping in front of fast-moving vehicles. He enjoys himself for a few years in spite of friendly warnings. Up to this point, you would label him as foolish. This story is fantastic, I think, because it really is ludicrous, and it really is kind of a perfect analogy. Like, we keep running into traffic, and then even when we get hit, we go back into traffic thinking it'll be different, or we won't get hit, or it wasn't that bad. Paragraph before the jaywalker story. I mean, I think that's probably true for most humans. The sort of have a drink because you're nervous, angry, worried, depressed, or jealous, something like that. It's just that when we take the first drink, we don't know what will happen next. It's almost certain that we'll keep on drinking. And then what? Page 39. But the actual or potential alcoholic, with hardly an exception, will be absolutely unable to stop drinking on the basis of self-knowledge. I ask you, is this 100% true? Surely not. Surely there are people who have stopped with the help of a therapist. My experience, however, is that nothing worked as well as having both the self-knowledge and a big group of people who knew exactly how I felt. This is not what I expected as someone who had always hated people, hated groups, didn't want to join. I was not someone who thought joining a group would help me in any way, but it did so tremendously. Empathy, understanding is very powerful. To be able to open up your life to someone and have faith that he or she or they will not judge you is incredible. That is a power greater than me. A great deal of it is within me. And what isn't within me, I find in other people, no matter how you identify right now, atheist, agnostic, searching, angry, stick with me, and together we'll find a way.